Questions for reflection. In our first reading, we encounter the great prophet Elijah. He has stood up against the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel with daring and courage. But then he ran from Jezebel, sat under a broom tree and wanted to die. He then hid in a cave. In all of his human reactions, the Lord is still speaking to and teaching his prophet. In this passage, Elijah hears the Lord in a whisper. In that experience of weakness, Elijah found freedom, and so can we. Often it takes the depletion of all of our own efforts and resources before we are willing to give up and give in to him. Elijah learned to hear the voice of God as he passed by, not in a mighty wind, an earthquake, or a fire, but in a gentle whisper. God's intervention at Mount Carmel was a testimony to his power, but so was his whisper on Mount Horeb. Elijah's surrender to the still small voice teaches us to hear the voice of God, not in spite of, but through difficult times. And when we reach the end of ourselves, we find the beginning of faith. As David reminds us in the psalm response, his saving help is near for those who fear him. And in our second reading, taken from the 9th chapter of his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul, formerly the Rabbi Saul, a persecutor of the early Christians, reveals his deep love for the Jewish people and his heartfelt desire for them to come to know Jesus as the promised Jewish Messiah. This is so even though many of his former colleagues persecuted him. Paul would be willing to offer himself for their own salvation. Wow! How eager are we for our own families, our friends, let alone those who persecute us, to find Jesus Christ. The gospel passage from St. Matthew's Gospel is his account of Jesus walking on the sea, a physical miracle, but also a spiritual lesson. Peter's reaction teaches us about living faith. We can miss our encounter with the Lord if we think that the story is only about Peter and the disciples, something distant which happened over 2 millennia ago. The story is meant for you and me in the here and now. The Jewish people lived under Roman rule for so long they had adopted a number of Roman practices. The Roman practice of dividing the night into 4 watches or divisions of 3 hours was one of those practices. This was particularly important for those engaged in nautical activity. The 4th watch was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. We live much of our daily life in the 4th watch of the night, at the time just before daybreak. At the end of a night which seems like it will never end, we often live in waves of struggle, filled with fear and crippled as a result, and unable to see the Lord on the horizon of hope. And this story shows us how to overcome fear through faith, inviting us to live differently, to walk on the waters of daily life by dynamic living faith. The winds and sea raged, and they became horribly afraid. Their fear was so crippling they did not even recognize Jesus as he came toward them. They thought he was a ghost. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid," he spoke with such reassurance and tenderness. Our fears so often cloud our vision, and we're unable to even recognize the Lord, the one who's always there, always coming to guide us on his way. He invites us to respond in faith, and when we do, grace helps us overcome our fear and walk into freedom. That's what happened with Peter. But when he looked for Jesus and kept his eyes focused on Jesus, he was able to do what seemed to be impossible. When he walked by faith, he walked into the freedom that comes from Jesus, the Lord of the winds and the sea. We live our lives in Jesus Christ, and we can learn to be at peace at home in the boat of the church. We can always find him in the 4th watch of the night. When we turn our faith into a verb, we get our sea legs, as they say in the nautical culture. We learn a new way of living and of loving. Fear becomes a field of choice, an occasion for trust. In the 4th watch of the night, there's a bridge between fear and freedom, which passes through Jesus, who tells all who will fix their eyes upon him, "Take courage. It is I. Be not afraid."